Hey, this is John Ridley.
And this is Matt Carey, documentary editor at Deadline.com.
You know, Matt, a really great person once said to me, it's okay to keep things simple. What are we doing this week?
Well, we are keeping it simple or complicated, as the case may be, if you look at it in terms of the documentary field. But we're going to speak with two of the most successful people in the industry. Justin Wilkes, who is the president of Imagine Entertainment, of course, the company founded by Ron Howard and Brian Grazer, and Sara Bernstein, who is the president of Imagine Documentaries, the nonfiction division of Imagine.
Yeah, you talk about two of the most successful people representing a very successful company doing documentaries. Among their Emmy eligible projects, David Blaine, Do Not Attempt, music by John Williams, Light and Magic Season 2, which is about industrial light and magic, George Lucas's very famous post-production company. Upcoming documentaries, they have a new film that's going to be premiering at the Tribeca Film Festival. Barbara Walters, Tell Me Everything. I had the opportunity to see that. And of course, you and I had the opportunity to talk to the great and very gracious Ron Howard, who is the director of Jim Henson Idea Man. That was I believe, 5-time Emmy Award winner
last year. Yeah.
Last year. And I believe that's on Disney. Is that on Apple?
No, that's Disney.
That's Disney. They do.
Yeah.
I mean, they're basically doing some documentaries from everybody.
Because Disney owns the Jim Henson Company. So I don't think they'd be too happy if it showed up on Apple. Somewhere else. But you never know.
Which, by the way, in our conversations, we get into that and conversations about the landscape, conversations about how they navigate these spaces where you're dealing with not just the documentary subject itself, sometimes having partners who are subjects, but also have sometimes creative control over the documentary space and how difficult that is. And also the rise of branded content, where it's not just short form anymore. Branded content is turning into content in and of itself. So it's a wide-ranging conversation, to say the least.
Yeah, here's our conversation with Justin Wilkes and Sara Bernstein. We're really excited to have on the show today Justin Wilkes, the president of Imagine Entertainment, and Sara Bernstein, who is the president of Imagine Documentaries. Thanks for being with us today on Doc.
Thanks for having us. Happy to be here.
You guys are incredibly active in the documentary space. The division was launched in 2018, and since then you've done more than 60 films. I'm curious, just to start things off, why documentaries? Why did Imagine want to get into the documentary space in such a robust way?
You know, it's interesting when you sort of look back at the filmography of Imagine, both movies that Ron's been drawn to as a director, Brian as a producer, and even just beyond that, just projects that as a brand Imagine has leaned towards. More often than not, they're based on true stories. Apollo 13, Beautiful Mind, 8 Mile, version of a true story, Friday Night Lights, the list goes on. And along the way, while Ron and Brian and others at the company were making feature films and television shows, documentaries just weren't a part of their core business plan. As much as they were drawn to true stories, docs just weren't something that the studios at that point were looking to them from. And frankly, at that point, wasn't even really much of an industry. I'll give Sara a lot of credit for being at HBO, one of the few places for decades that was buying docs. It was kind of like HBO and PBS were it. So that said, the first project that I actually ever interacted with Ron and Brian on was Ron's first doc, and it was Jay-Z, Made in America, and it was about Jay-Z putting on a music festival in Philadelphia, and sort of the story behind that.
What's up, Philadelphia?
This festival's Jay-Z's vision.
We've never done anything like this before. This is a big thing, and we can do big things.
This is going to be a 180-foot span. It's the biggest one I've ever seen.
It's a bigger idea than just the concert. We all have the same struggles.
And Ron really got the bug after that. And shortly thereafter, he did the Beatles doc, and then also followed that up with Pavarotti. But it was still sort of a side project for the company. We weren't necessarily looking at it as a revenue stream. They weren't necessarily seeing it as a business. But as time went on, and I got to know the guys a bit more, we actually worked on a hybrid series. It was called Mars, and it was part doc and part scripted. And through that, around the same time, the guys had taken on some investment capital to grow the company, and they started to identify different areas that they wanted to lean into. Kids and family was an example of that. John, as we were talking before, branded entertainment was an example of that, and docs and non-scripted. And in sort of a very fateful meeting I had with the two of them as we were discussing our season 2 of Mars, they sort of broached the subject of, hey, we're thinking about leaning in a little more into this space. This was right before the doc wave really started to take off. So they were kind of onto something. And I very quickly said, having at that point, I was the president of Radical Media and having produced a lot of docs. I said, this can be a business and there's a way to do it. And if you bring in the right people, we could actually create something that could be really exciting. And that's kind of how it started.
Well, we definitely want to follow up on this aspect of it being a business and how you respond to the marketplace, as it were, both in terms of the audience, but also in terms of what the platforms are buying, what they're interested in. But I want to talk about some of the individual films, of course, you've done recently and have coming out soon, and curious about how those stories come to you typically, if there is a typical way. And Sara, for instance, the Barbara Walters documentary that you have premiering at Tribeca, or I think also of Lucy and Desi, which is about Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz that Amy Poehler directed. Those are two situations where you're certainly dealing with estates there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, documentary ideas come to us in various ways. Sometimes there are other filmmakers who come to us with ideas. Sometimes a personality might come to us interested in working on a documentary. And I think in the case of both, actually, Barbara Walters and Lucy and Desi, I think those projects really started with conversations at Imagine. And with Barbara Walters, it evolved through a conversation that we had with Betsy West, who is
yes, of course.
Wonderful Betsy West, who directed our Julia Child doc, and RBG with Julie Cohen, and many others. But she had worked at ABC News and had the pleasure of working with Barbara. And it was soon after Barbara passed away, and we just started talking about, wow, I wonder if there's something here that hasn't been done before. And so we reached out at that point to our partners at ABC News Studios, because obviously, they were sitting on this tremendous archive of footage of Barbara over decades that, frankly, they didn't even know what kind of gold they had at that point. And so it became a conversation, and we looked under the hood, so to speak, and then we realized there was something really special here.
She asked the question that nobody else had asked.
I know you don't want to talk about guys, and I won't push it, but how are you going to find anybody?
You don't really act. You don't sing. You don't dance. You don't have any, forgive me, any talent.
And asked it in a way that always hit a nerve.
Why the tears now?
I had the opportunity to watch the Barbara Walters documentary, and that is going to be premiering at Tribeca, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then it will be on Hulu.
And then it will be on Hulu. The doc is really, really interesting. And it's interesting, obviously, in two parts. Barbara Walters, like everyone, is multifaceted. But there's the professional level, which even in 2025, where I hope that guys working in spaces understand the difficulties of people outside the prevailing culture. But you go back to the early 70s with Barbara Walters breaking in to primetime news. She'd been on the Today Show, but primetime was where men trod. It's where, guys in gray flannel suits got the news while ladies were fixing dinner. Talk about just a little bit Barbara Walters moving into that space and what it really meant for women. And we hear it from Oprah. We hear it from Connie Chung. What it meant and what it was like for Barbara Walters. $1 million in 1976. It's a little Austin Powers, but $1 million was like $1 billion back then. She was getting $5 million, and the pressure that she was under to represent.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad you picked up on this as, obviously like an important driver of the documentary, because I think that is so much of what we all, and certainly Jackie Jesko, our wonderful director, really wanted to accomplish with presenting Barbara's story. I think it was really about sort of the challenges of being the only woman in the room,
right,
the pressure to remain, you know, in that space, in that chair, in that spotlight. I think probably a little the anxiety around sort of the other, you know, women who I think she was both, my impression was very interested in lifting, but also I think she was incredibly conscious of what she had accomplished and what it took for her to get there. So, you know, the $1 million is really interesting, right? Because I mean, she was the first broadcast journalist, hands down, to make that money.
Yeah.
And I think that was pretty remarkable. So that was woman or man. And that became a big kind of talking point. And you saw the way that she was portrayed in the press around that salary. And I think, you know, ultimately it is sort of her legacy, right? Because I think what the film, I hope, explains to viewers, or at least tries to present objectively to viewers, is that it's not easy being a woman. It's not easy being a mother. It's not easy being a working mother. And having that incredible drive, and not only having that drive, but really being able to kind of change, reshape pop culture as a result of that drive. And that's something that I think all of us on the producing team, I can't speak for Justin as our man on the producing team, but
he's going to agree. The new age, he's agreeing.
100%. I think, you know, most of us, even today, it's hard to be, you know, it's hard to do it all. You can't do it all well. And I think, you know, that's something I think the film explores. And I think Oprah, it is remarkable what Oprah says to that.
Yeah. Her candor about that is incredible.
Yeah, the folks that you lined up in the interviews obviously are tremendous. Because I want to give a full picture of this documentary. I don't mean to give it short shrift, but when you talk about being a woman alone back in the day, Harry Reasoner, and I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but his contempt for her, it wasn't even veiled. It wasn't even like, okay, well, I don't like you, but we got to work together. I don't like you, but it's important for the audience to understand that we have a working relationship. Johnny Carson would make jokes about how much he couldn't stand her. But there was a moment and a pivot where she nails an interview with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. And for young people out there, I know you see what's going on in the Middle East, and perhaps you think this is new stress and new global politics. It's been going on forever. It was tense. But not only did she get the interview, but those men, with a level of respect and perhaps a level of the male gaze, I can't pretend that wasn't there, but they did respect her as a journalist enough to say, oh, you know, Anwar Sadat grabbing her arm, pulling her closer than Walter Cronkite. That's amazing.
Great moment.
To see that there were international individuals who recognized that at the very least she was on par with the best male journalist of the era.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great moment. I think in the documentary, one of my favorites. I think that's what she was up against. I mean, I can't put myself in Harry's shoes at that time, but clearly he felt threatened. And I think that's what, you know, being a trailblazer, I guess, sometimes is, and sometimes what kind of results from that. But I think, to your point, you know, her intellect and her tenacity, but I think also her ability to connect with people in high positions is what ultimately, you know, allowed her to really become Barbara Walters.
Barbara Walters was known for her celebrity interviews. And in the film, you make it clear that Barbara Walters, because someone was a celebrity, she did not necessarily softball them. She had a way to maybe ingratiate herself and then turn a little bit and get into harder interviews. So that is part of, I think, the push-pull of celebrity docs. But within the doc itself, you do get into some fairly deep personal, I don't want to say issues, but moments with Barbara Walters, particularly her relationships with men. Don't want to define a woman in terms of her relationship with men, but this is in the film. And a lot of it has to do with her father and what happened with her father. And you can say about men, sometimes we're just looking for our partners, what we had in our mothers. and perhaps with women, they're looking for what they had or didn't have with her father. Can you talk a little bit about her father and two particular relationships, Roy Cohn and Ed Brooke? And I don't think two men that you could pick, particularly in that time period, have a more difficult relationship with, if at all, than Roy Cohn and Ed Brooke.
With her father, clearly, again, it's so hard because everything we're gleaning is from Barbara's, autobiography and, what we were able to uncover. And we're not talking to her directly, but, clearly there was a particular relationship that she had with her father. And he was a particular model of a father and a husband. And he was one who had a very active social life. Obviously, he worked in show business. As she says, he was around celebrities, introduced her to celebrities, made her actually feel comfortable around notable people, which I think is interesting in terms of just her career trajectory. But, clearly there were complications with him and money issues. And, in particular, I think that Roy Cohen relationship really touches upon that. And also, I think just in terms of what Barbara was willing to do as a daughter.
Yeah, and Justin, I'm curious, the Barbara Walters documentary, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's, I don't see folks with, Barbara Walters' daughter, for instance, being an executive producer on this. And I bring it up because also in the Jim Henson Idea Man, the documentary that Ron Howard directed, which won 5 Emmys, by the way, last year, that also the Henson family were not producing this. So in other words, these are not quote unquote authorized biographies. To what extent is that an important discussion for you at Imagine as to whether, you as a company and your filmmakers have full, leeway, if you will, to make the kind of stories that they want to make?
It's a good question. And the Henson film was produced with the support of the Henson family. So it's an important distinction. So while they made a conscious decision not to take any sort of producerial role on the film, we couldn't have made the film without their support, without their archive.
For sure. Yeah.
And I would say as a matter of sort of strategy here, both with our docs and frankly a lot of our scripted projects, if it's about a particular person, more often than not, whether they're dead or alive, working with that person or working with that estate is going to yield, in our opinion, a better kind of result, just in terms of the access and support that you're going to get. We couldn't have made the Louis Armstrong movie without the support of the Louis Armstrong Foundation. We couldn't have done the Beatles without the Beatles. So the trade-off is you can make an unauthorized film, but then you're going to be very limited in terms of what materials you might have to work with. In the case of Henson, and I'd say this is a good sort of litmus test for any project we do, including most recently, we did a fantastic series, if I do say so myself, a fantastic series, the Earnhardt family dynasty, which is now on Amazon, again, with the full support of both NASCAR and the Earnhardts. You want to make sure that you have an aligned goal at the very beginning of a project.
Dale Earnhardt in car number 2 as a rookie to watch in this race.
I admired everything about my dad.
Look at that precision driving right to the line.
Dale Earnhardt is champion.
I admired how dedicated he was to racing.
You want to make sure that the story that we want to tell, the reason we want to tell this, aligns with that of the family or the foundation. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it might start in a way where it does, and then as you get further into it and you start screening cuts, you realize it doesn't. What's most important to us is that as a producing entity and also as filmmakers, if we're going to bring a filmmaker in, we want our filmmaker to be able to tell the balanced, appropriate story of that person. We want to protect our filmmaker to be able to have, if they can't get final cut necessarily, but at least have the element of control. And to date, Sarah can attest to this too, we have not been in a situation as of yet, out of all the films we made and of all the estates and people we work with, where there's been anyone who's disowned a project at the end or come out and spoken ill of a project. I mean, we and I'll give Sarah as much credit on this too. If you thought uniting the Beatles was difficult, bringing the 4 original supermodels together was truly a feat unto itself, and we managed to keep that together. And
the Roger Ross Williams documentary.
And this maybe, John, goes to your sort of question, or I know that topic of sort of celebrity docs in general, first and foremost, I sort of take issue, and I'll actually give this full props to Martin Scorsese. We had the pleasure of doing a project with him, both as a producer in the case of the Robbie Robertson Once We're Brothers doc, and then as a filmmaker with the David Johansen doc. Marty doesn't call documentaries. He's aware of the form, obviously, but he doesn't refer to them as documentaries. He calls them movies or pictures. They're pictures. We're making a movie. And I loved that because documentaries are a genre of movie. Documentary within the format of documentary can also have different genres. You can have a verite film. You can have an archive-based film. You can have an investigative film. You can have a music film. You can have a film that's just straight up celebrity profile entertainment, and you can have the most hardest hitting, issue-based, politically charged film. And I actually take a bit of issue, not to get too political on this one, but I don't think as a branch, as the Academy branch, we've done a good enough job, especially through now what has been the heyday of documentary storytelling, accepting and honoring that there can be different kinds of docs. So when you have an article that comes out that specifically targets celebrity doc, I don't think that's fair, when it should really come from a perspective of, this is entertainment, we're telling stories, and if it's done exceptionally well, if it can hold itself up to all of the same scrutiny that you would put any sort of movie under, is it written well, is it produced well, is it acted well, is the story told well, then what difference does it make? Each one of these genres can serve a certain audience and can serve a certain function.
Yeah, and the one thing I would just add to that is also, I think it depends on who is the celebrity you're profiling. I mean, I do think that becomes kind of a conversation, right? And I think RJ Cutler, to give him some credit with the Martha Stewart documentary, I mean, if you have somebody who has, there are controversial aspects of their life, of their career, that there is going to be an expectation to approach those subjects, and maybe then, yes, like there's a little more of a journalistic kind of sensibility that should be expected from that documentary. I mean, I think that's something that, maybe to what Justin's saying is worth really taking into consideration, because I also feel like if you were going to do a project like John Williams, who is maybe a lesser known celebrity, but the goal of doing John Williams is really to pay attention to his craft, to his art, to give this unsung hero of the movie magic really his due. It's not that we're not going to ask him about what it was like to lose his wife, with such young children, and other personal questions, but the goal of what you're trying to achieve is definitely different. And I think that goes into just having a real collective understanding of what is sort of the objective. And I think most filmmakers do a really good job with maintaining control of their film when it's, really, really necessary to do that.
You two are, and for our audience, I want to make sure that they can follow the conversation. What you're responding to is an article that was written in the Hollywood Reporter that came out on June 1st. It's called "Are Music and Other Celebrity Films Killing the Documentary?" And that article talks much about what you've already responded to, in terms of it can be hurtful in some places, but you have to go in with intent in others. Also, Justin, one of the things that I found very interesting that you were talking about, that sometimes we have to look at documentaries in more than being just one thing, that there are subcategories within that subcategory. And I would point you to an article that was written by a gentleman named Matt Carey that came out in Deadline the other day, that really posed that question: what does the Cannes Film Festival have against documentaries? And the fact that they are a little bit siloed. So there's this push-pull where some people have, and by the way, I talked about on our podcast, one of the responders in the, the chat, whatever you call that, I don't read them enough, the responder space, where people who don't want to put their names but have all the intelligence in the world like to respond. But somebody said, documentaries aren't films. And that was very painful for me, because I look at documentaries as being films. So it's complicated. I think that's all we can say, is that it's complicated. And as a business, you all, you got to keep the lights on. You got to keep people employed. And there are documentary filmmakers who look at, as you said, Justin, as well, used to be PBS and HBO. And there was perhaps a more narrow strata of what docs were meant to be. And now with Netflix and now with Hulu, they have other things that they're looking for.
I mean, it's sort of interesting, and we've spent a lot of time talking about this, even just between Justin and I, and certainly as our team at Imagine. I mean, when we started, Justin pretty much said it, and you just said it again. I mean, HBO, PBS, and let's give the great Sheila Evans a lot of credit for really bringing the format to a popular audience. But when I left HBO to join Justin at Imagine and launching this division, there was just starting to be this proliferation of the streaming market. I mean, Amazon was just kind of starting to get into the documentary business. I mean, I think we were one of the first look deals at Apple. This was before even Molly Thompson was there running the doc division. Obviously, there was Netflix. Disney was just launching, and we may have had a couple of the first documentary projects over at Disney. So all of a sudden, there was this, proliferation of these streaming platforms, and with that, like the desire for content. And I think, what we kind of think about a lot is just, when you have a great need for content, and everybody talks about the great sort of contraction of the marketplace, not just for documentaries, but for scripted. There was a lot of money being thrown at these projects. And I think when you have documentaries that are being made and being sold for enormous budgets, and look, we benefited, we were the beneficiaries of that, of course, over the past few years, but there is a demand for some sort of great audience return on those projects. And I think it's, it is why there is this whole conversation right now about the state of the documentary market, because the documentary genre became a business, it became a market. And I don't think it's totally unreasonable that the streamers want some results for the amount of money that they're spending. And it's not totally unusual either that they realize, oh, people like celebrity docs, or they really like sports docs, they like true crime. I mean, it kind of mirrors what they watch on TV to begin with. So I think what, we have to think about is, how do we also get these, these other important projects out into the marketplace? And how can we, convince our streaming partners to maybe pay attention to a documentary that can have impact? And look, I think a great example of that is Gita Ganbir's My Perfect Neighbor, or The Perfect Neighbor, rather.
The Perfect Neighbor, yeah.
Sundance, and I know Gita very well, and that's a great success story, and that's a film that has tremendous heart and is heart-wrenching to watch. But what she was able to put together with that footage is riveting. So it's interesting that Netflix stepped in the way that they did for that, and I think that gives me hope that there are other projects that maybe are more about sort of the journalistic side of the documentary world that will be made.
I think there is a bigger picture that was also an article that came out in IndieWire on Monday about some of the documentaries that Netflix is striking individual deals for that are not the obvious celebrity-driven films, for instance. And I think a number of films that HBO has done are not obviously, documentary films or series are not obviously celebrity-driven. I think of Ren Fair, which is an Emmy competition, has a little bit of that Tiger King vibe to it of Americana, strange characters out there, and
but that feels like docutainment,
Yeah, and I want to follow up with Justin about the, we're talking about music by John Williams, which is directed by Laurent Bouzereau. I cannot say his name often enough because I just love that, of pure poetry. Laurent Bouzereau, who's a wonderful filmmaker and a wonderful guy and a wonderful filmmaker. I mean, I just thought that was a fantastic film. It was did qualify for Oscar consideration this year, did not make the short list, but now is an Emmy competition. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Justin, you were referring to that a little bit in bringing up the doc branch, that that perhaps they give short shrift to films that are, quote unquote, a little bit more genre driven. Whereas the Emmys, I think, is willing to entertain those.
I think that's right. I mean, there's so much crossover, at least in the United States, with the voting block between the TV Academy and the doc branch and the Film Academy. You know, the Film Academy, and specifically the doc branch, to its credit, and I think Roger Ross Williams was a big proponent of this when he was one of the governors, which was to really increase membership, both the diversity of membership and the geographic diversity of membership, and did an incredible job, probably more so than any of the other branches in being able to open the aperture. That's the good news. I think what then you're also seeing as a result of that, and it's by no fault of anybody, just where voting blocks are, that there's a significant European faction that's now in the doc branch, and that European faction tends to vote toward projects that have more journalistic integrity, projects that are raising issues, in some cases projects that don't even necessarily have US distribution. So I do think there's a little bit of a reckoning that needs to take place, and maybe a little bit of the fixing of the of the rules a bit. I think looking at the other categories that you can opt into as a branch member, for example, animation is one, and also international film. The branch votes on the short list, and I think if you look at the doc short list, even this past year, 15 films, it actually was a pretty good indication of the variety of the genre. And then the doc branch also then votes on the final 5, whereas for international, it's open to the whole branch. So maybe there's a world where things can shift, but I'm not here to preach that. But to go back, to the Emmys, I think the Emmys just have historically had a much broader voting base, and I think a project that ultimately lands on a streaming platform. In the case of both Henson and John Williams, they both had limited theatrical, but let's be honest, they were both very much engineered towards streaming because that's where the eyeballs were going to be. Then Emmys make sense, and Henson, as you pointed out, was a wonderful beneficiary of the love last year from the Academy, and I think I hope John Williams has a chance too, only because I just want to hear someone on stage say Laurent Bouzereau.
Maybe I can volunteer my services as a voiceover guy, at least for that category.
He's as wonderful to work with as it is to say his name. I can attest.
He's a delightful guy, and I was curious about that. I know, John, I'm hopefully not crowding you out here with all these questions I'm asking, but for both of you, of what documentary projects do you wish that you could have done, but just felt that they were not sellable in the current market?
Oh God, like every day. There's a lot I see that I wish we could do.
Yeah, look, I think there would be too many to mention, and I think Sara and I sort of share a similar approach to this, which is, every project we've done, and you asked this question earlier on, sort of where do these ideas come from? Some of them come from filmmakers, some of them even come from our streaming partners or studio partners, and most of them, I'd say, come from us internally. Both Sara and I and our team, Meredith Coffers, Kelsey Field, Chris St. John, Erica Fink, and our development team, we're all consumers of the genre. We all just love consuming stories, and we'll pick a project. Of course, in the back of our mind, it's always, can we sell it? But as history is evidenced, sometimes these things take years. And we also have a unique ability at Imagine where we can start to finance projects. And we don't do that all the time. But for things we really believe in, we say, you know what? We might not be able to sell this today, but this story has to get told. Let's just figure it out. And either individually or with partners, we'll just start making it. And we have a pretty good track record, Sara. We haven't written anything off. We've managed to get everything out into the marketplace in one way, shape, or form that we've put our minds to. And I think it's a real testament, really to the team.
Before we let you go, even before we started rolling, Justin, I feel like when I talk to you, sometimes talking to like a politician who's ready to get out there and really create some change for the people. We were talking a little bit about the shift in branded content, and where branded content used to be a very specific sort of a long form commercial. Now it's moving in towards spaces where, whether it's scripted or non-scripted, that it really is a bit more feature length and ways to engage an audience in slightly different ways. If you could talk a little bit about where you see branded content now and where you see it going. You just had strong, and I don't mean strong like negative or pejorative opinions, but very strong opinions. And there was an article in The Verge about how this is becoming no longer branded content, it's becoming content. And I'm just curious how you feel about it and where you think it may be going.
Sure. I think to see where it's going, you actually have to go back to the beginning of where it's from. And I'll spare you a whole history lesson, but let's not forget that television as a medium and radio before that was purely born from advertising. Brands like Procter & Gamble, ExxonMobil, many others were single sponsors of programs. That's how television ultimately became a successful medium. I don't want to say it wasn't about the programs, it was, but the programs were completely in service of selling advertising. So then flash forward, you have this new model called streaming, and suddenly advertising's not a thing. We want to give subscribers an uninterrupted experience. And our metric for success is going to be subscriber growth, because subscriber growth leads to stock price growth. And that's been sort of the prevailing logic until suddenly it wasn't. And then everybody woke up and said, wait a second, there's billions of dollars of advertising money sitting on the sidelines. In fact, it's the advertising money that powered the whole industry. We can't forget about that. Let's let them back in again. And you're starting to see the Netflixes of the world and Amazons, and not quite Apple. Disney already had a version of that because so many of their platforms were already advertiser supported. Anyway, but the advertisers during that period of time of not being led into the main event went over to the sideshow, and the sideshow is YouTube, and the sideshow is social media. And in fact, the sideshow then overtook the main show, so that when the brands came back onto the main show, they said, wait a second, interruptive advertising is not the future. Nobody wants to sit and watch a show and be interrupted. That's so 90s. That's so like early 2000s. Like, what's the new version of that? Oh, then the Barbie movie comes out. And suddenly the world says, wow, you can make a movie that's entertaining. You can make a movie that's fun to watch. You can bring your family to. My God, it's got Margot Robbie in it. And oh my God, it's actually all about a brand, right? So that became sort of this North Star that now so many major brands, the smart ones certainly, the Coca-Colas of the world, the Procter & Gambles of the world, the Nikes, the long list, they want to create content and or support content that ladders up to the values of that brand. So in the case of, let's say, a Nike, it could be very specific. It's about an athlete. It's be about a specific sport. It could be, and we've seen versions of that where Nike has literally been the financier or the co-financier of projects. And then in Procter & Gamble, it might not even be so product specific. It might be the values of what they're trying to put out into the world, the values of what the brand stands for. They want to back content that supports that. So we're, as I joked to you before, any path to get projects made and financed is a path, we're going to take. But ultimately, we still put ourselves in the position of, as an audience, as the consumer, does this pass the smell test? Do I feel like I'm being sold something? Or, like in the old days, am I just so appreciative that I can watch a program uninterrupted because it was brought to you by a brand that maybe now I care a little bit more about because they delivered this great thing for me? So we're working with brands, certainly in the non-scripted space, but now even more so in the scripted space, where brands are actually helping to finance development of scripts, in some cases acquiring stories. And the most fun we have is when we get invited to the archives of so many of these brands. And you can imagine out of central casting, the archivist for like General Mills, like what that person looks like. And then we go into the archive, we're like, oh my God, there's like an amazing story that even if the brand wasn't going to pay for it, we'd still want to make it. That's the litmus test for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It certainly makes me think of the studio, the new Apple series with the Kool-Aid movie. And then of course we see that the Minecraft movie is a great big hit for Warner Brothers Discovery.
Huge.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's very, very interesting, but it's been so fascinating to hear your very candid insights about the industry and about your individual products. Sorry, I really misspoke there. Projects.
Hey, branded content, man, embrace.
All right, I really didn't mean that. I don't think I meant that. But you have so many, both upcoming and that you've done recently. We talked about Barbara Walters' Tell Me Everything, which is premiering at Tribeca. You have a number of projects in the Emmy race, including David Blaine, Do Not Attempt, the documentary series, music by John Williams, Laurent Bouzereau's documentary about the great composer, We didn't mention Frida, marvelous film directed by Carla Gutierrez about Frida Kahlo that was shortlisted for the Academy Awards. Light and Magic Season 2 about industrial light and magic. You're doing remarkable work, successful work in the documentary space. And thank you so much, Justin Wilkes, president of Imagine Entertainment, and Sara Bernstein, president of Imagine Documentaries, for joining us. It's been such a treat.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, John.
Thank
really
you so
appreciate
much.
it.
It's been fun.
Again, that was our conversation with Sara Bernstein, the president of Imagine Documentaries, and Justin Wilkes, who's the president of Imagine Entertainment. Very interesting. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like to do volume work, but also being very cognizant that you have to do work that is still rigorous.
Yeah, and I think, that comes through in the work that Imagine Documentaries does, that, I think it's many other projects are, you would say, celebrity driven. Not all of them. They do have all kinds of projects. I mean, I think of Rebuilding Paradise, which was about the wildfires that destroyed Paradise, California. I mean, that, so some of their work, like Pets, also directed by Bryce Dallas Howard, Ron Howard's daughter. I mean, that's not a genre-driven film, but they're very successful, and they do know what sells in the marketplace, and they're savvy in that respect of responding to the interests of both the audience and what the platforms, the streamers, the other distributors are interested in.
Yeah, at the end of the day, all of us, and as they talked about, whether it's nonfiction, whether it's narrative, you got to figure things out. There's a landscape, and we're all out there sort of orientating ourselves as best we can. Speaking of people who are doing things as best we can, we are running up against the Emmy nomination season.
Yes,
and
very exciting.
As two guys who like to talk about documentaries, I think it might be a good idea next week for us to talk about some documentary films and perhaps some documentary filmmakers who are Emmy contenders.
I think so, absolutely. So looking forward to that. Wow.
And we have outstanding people who are on it right now. We don't have an answer for you at the moment. We don't know who we're going to be talking to. But in all seriousness, furiously looking, and it is Emmy season. I think we may be able to scrounge up a couple of folks who have some top quality product and want to talk about it. So, Matt, as always, it's good to see you. I feel like we're back in a groove. I felt like we were separated for a moment. You were in Europe, hanging out with big celebrities. I was in the Valley, going to pavilions to see if they have some local yogurt. But we've all got our assignments. We're back together, and I look forward to next week doing some Emmy conversations with you as well.
We'll see you next week on Doc Talk.